Classics in Audiobook presents The Life of Claudius by Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus, Part 2. The courts of judicature, whose sittings had been formally divided between the summer and winter months, he ordered, for the dispatch of business, to sit the whole year round. The jurisdiction in matters of trust, which used to be granted annually by special commission to certain magistrates, and in the city only, he made permanent, and extended to the provincial judges likewise. He altered a clause added by Tiberius to the Papiapopian law, which inferred that men of 60 years of age were incapable of begetting children. He ordered that, out of the ordinary course of proceeding, orphans might have guardians appointed them by the consuls, and that those who were banished from any province by the chief magistrate should be debarred from coming into the city or any part of Italy. He inflicted on certain persons a new sort of banishment, by forbidding them to depart further than 3 miles from Rome. When any affair of importance came before the Senate, he used to sit between the 2 consuls upon the seats of the tribunes. He reserved to himself the power of granting license to travel out of Italy, which before had belonged to the Senate. He likewise granted the consular ornaments to his Ducenarian procurators. From those who declined the senatorian dignity, he took away the equestrian. Although he had in the beginning of his reign declared that he would admit no man into the Senate who was not the great-grandson of a Roman citizen, yet he gave the broad hem to the son of a freedman, on condition that he should be adopted by a Roman knight. Being afraid, however, of incurring censure by such an act, he informed the public that his ancestor Appius Secus, the censor, had elected the sons of freedmen into the Senate, for he was ignorant, it seems, that in the times of Appius, and a long while afterwards, persons manumitted were not called freedmen, but only their sons who were freeborn. Instead of the expense which the College of Quaestors was obliged to incur in paving the highways, he ordered them to give the people an exhibition of gladiators, and relieving them of the provinces of Ostia and Cisalpine Gaul, he reinstated them in the charge of the treasury, which, since it was taken from them, had been managed by the praetors, or those who had formerly filled that office. He gave the triumphal ornaments to Silanus, who was betrothed to his daughter, though he was under age, and in other cases he bestowed them on so many, and with so little reserve, that there is extant a letter unanimously addressed to him by all the legions, begging him to grant his consular lieutenants the triumphal ornaments at the time of their appointment to commands, in order to prevent their seeking occasion to engage in unnecessary wars. He decreed to Aulus Plautius the honour of an ovation, going to meet him at his entering the city, and walking with him in the procession to the Capitol, and back, in which he took the left side, giving him the post of honour. He allowed Gabinius Secundus, upon his conquest of the Chauci, a German tribe, to assume the cognomen of Chaucius. His military organization of the equestrian order was this. After having the command of a cohort, they were promoted to a wing of auxiliary horse, and subsequently received the commission of tribune of a legion. He raised a body of militia, who were called supernumeraries, who, though they were a sort of soldiers, and kept in reserve, yet received pay. He procured an act of the Senate to prohibit all soldiers from attending senators at their houses, in the way of respect and compliment. He confiscated the estates of all freedmen who presumed to take upon themselves the equestrian rank. Such of them as were ungrateful to their patrons, and were complained of by them, he reduced to their former condition of slavery, and declared to their advocates that he would always give judgment against the freedmen in any suit at law which the masters might happen to have with them. Some persons having exposed their sick slaves, in a languishing condition, on the island of Aesculapius, because of the tediousness of their cure, he declared all who were so exposed perfectly free never more to return, if they should recover, to their former servitude, and that if any one chose to kill at once, rather than expose, a slave, he should be liable for murder. He published a proclamation, forbidding all travellers to pass through the towns of Italy any otherwise than on foot, or in a litter or chair. He quartered a cohort of soldiers at Puteoli, and another at Ostia, to be in readiness against any accidents from fire. He prohibited foreigners from adopting Roman names, especially those which belonged to families. Those who falsely pretended to the freedom of Rome, he beheaded on the Esquiline. He gave up to the Senate the provinces of Achaia and Macedonia, which Tiberius had transferred to his own administration. He deprived the Lycians of their liberties as a punishment for their fatal dissensions, but restored to the Rhodians their freedom upon their repenting of their former misdemeanors. He exonerated for ever the people of Ilium from the payment of taxes, as being the founders of the Roman race, reciting upon the occasion a letter in Greek from the Senate and people of Rome to King Seleucus, on which they promised him their friendship and alliance, provided that he would grant their kinsmen the Ilientians immunity from all burdens. He banished from Rome all the Jews, who were continually making disturbances at the instigation of one Chrestus. He allowed the ambassadors of the Germans to sit at the public spectacles in the seats assigned to the senators, being induced to grant them favours by their frank and honourable conduct. For, having been seated in the rows of benches which were common to the people, on observing the Parthian and Armenian ambassadors sitting among the senators, they took upon themselves to cross over into the same seats, as being, they said, no way inferior to the others, in point either of merit or rank. The religious rites of the Druids, solemnized with such horrid cruelties, which had only been forbidden the citizens of Rome during the reign of Augustus, he utterly abolished among the Gauls. On the other hand, he attempted to transfer the Eleusinian mysteries from Attica to Rome. He likewise ordered the temple of Venus Erycina in Sicily, which was old and in a ruinous condition, to be repaired at the expense of the Roman people. He concluded treaties with foreign princes in the Forum, with the sacrifice of a sow, and the form of words used by the heralds in former times. But in these and other things, and indeed the greater part of his administration, he was directed not so much by his own judgment, as by the influence of his wives and freedmen, for the most part acting in conformity to what their interests or fancies dictated. He was twice married at a very early age, first to Aemilia Lepida, the granddaughter of Augustus, and afterwards to Livia Medellina, who had the cognomen of Camilla, and was descended from the old dictator Camillus. The former he divorced while still a virgin, because her parents had incurred the displeasure of Augustus, and he lost the latter by sickness on the day fixed for their nuptials. He next married Plautia Ergulanilla, whose father had enjoyed the honour of a triumph, and soon afterwards Aelia Paetina, the daughter of a man of consular rank. But he divorced them both, Paetina upon some trifling causes of disgust, and Ergulanilla for scandalous lewdness and the suspicion of murder. After them he took in marriage Valeria Messalina, the daughter of Barbatus Messala, his cousin. But finding that, besides her other shameful debaucheries, she had even gone so far as to marry in his own absence Gaius Silius, the settlement of her dower being formally signed, in the presence of the augurs, he put her to death. When summoning his praetorians to his presence, he made to them this declaration: "As I have been so unhappy in my unions, I am resolved to continue in future unmarried, and if I should not, I give you leave to stab me." He was, however, unable to persist in this resolution, for he began immediately to think of another wife, and even of taking back Paetina, whom he had formerly divorced. He thought also of Lollia Paulina, who had been married to Gaius Caesar. But being ensnared by the arts of Agrippina, the daughter of his brother Germanicus, who took advantage of the kisses and endearments which their near relationship admitted, to inflame his desires, he got some one to propose at the next meeting of the Senate that they should oblige the emperor to marry Agrippina, as a measure highly conducive to the public interest, and that in future liberty should be given for such marriages, which until that time had been considered incestuous. In less than 24 hours after this, he married her. No person was found, however, to follow the example, excepting one freedman and a centurion of the first rank, at the solemnization of whose nuptials both he and Agrippina attended. He had children by 3 of his wives, by Ergulanilla, Drusus, and Claudia, by Paetina, Antonia, and by Messalina, Octavia, and also a son, whom at first he called Germanicus, but afterwards Britannicus. He lost Drusus at Pompeii, when he was very young, he being choked with a pear, which in his play he tossed into the air, and caught in his mouth. Only a few days before, he had betrothed him to one of Sejanus's daughters, and I am therefore surprised that some authors should say he lost his life by the treachery of Sejanus. Claudia, who was, in truth, the daughter of Bota his freedman, though she was born 5 months before his divorce, he ordered to be thrown naked at her mother's door. He married Antonia to Gnaeus Pompey the Great, and afterwards to Fausta Sylla, both youths of very noble parentage, Octavia to his stepson Nero, after she had been contracted to Silanus. Britannicus was born upon the 20th day of his reign, and in his second consulship. He often earnestly commended him to the soldiers, holding him in his arms before their ranks, and would likewise show him to the people in the theatre, setting him upon his lap, or holding him out whilst he was still very young, and was sure to receive their acclamations and good wishes on his behalf. Of his sons-in-law, he adopted Nero. He not only dismissed from his favour both Pompey and Silanus, but put them to death. Amongst his freedmen, the greatest favourite was the eunuch Posides, whom, in his British triumph, he presented with the pointless spear, classing him among the military men. Next to him, if not equal, in favour was Felix, whom he not only preferred to commands both of cohorts and troops, but to the government of the province of Judea, and he became, in consequence of his elevation, the husband of 3 queens. Another favourite was Harpocras, to whom he granted the privilege of being carried in a litter within the city, and of holding public spectacles for the entertainment of the people. In this class was likewise Polybius, who assisted him in his studies, and had often the honour of walking between the 2 consuls. But above all others, Narcissus, his secretary, and Pallas, the controller of his accounts, were in high favour with him. He not only allowed them to receive, by decree of the Senate, immense presents, but also to be decorated with the quaestorian and praetorian ensigns of honour. So much did he indulge them in amassing wealth, and plundering the public, that, upon his complaining, once, of the lowness of his exchequer, someone said, with great reason, that it would be full enough, if those 2 freedmen of his would but take him into partnership with them. Being entirely governed by these freedmen, and, as I have already said, by his wives, he was a tool to others, rather than a prince. He distributed offices, or the command of armies, pardoned or punished, according as it suited their interests, their passions, or their caprice, and for the most part, without knowing, or being sensible of what he did. Not to enter into minute details relative to the revocation of grants, the reversal of judicial decisions, obtaining his signature to fictitious appointments, or the barefaced alteration of them after signing, he put to death Appius Silanus, the father of his son-in-law, and the 2 Julias, the daughters of Drusus and Germanicus, without any positive proof of the crimes with which they were charged, or so much as permitting them to make any defence. He also cut off Gnaeus Pompey, the husband of his eldest daughter, and Lucius Silanus, who was betrothed to the younger Pompey, was stabbed in the act of unnatural lewdness with a favourite paramour. Silanus was obliged to quit the office of praetor upon the 4th of the calends of January, the 29th of December, and to kill himself on New Year's Day following, the very same on which Claudius and Agrippina were married. He condemned to death 35 senators, and above 300 Roman knights, with so little attention to what he did, that when a centurion brought him word of the execution of a man of consular rank, who was one of the number, and told him that he had executed his order, he declared, he had ordered no such thing, but that he approved of it, because his freedmen, it seems, had said, that the soldiers did nothing more than their duty, in dispatching the emperor's enemies without waiting for a warrant. But it is beyond all belief, that he himself, at the marriage of Messalina with the adulterous Silius, should actually sign the writings relative to her dowry, induced, as it is pretended, by the design of diverting from himself and transferring upon another the danger which some omens seemed to threaten him. Though his health was very infirm during the former part of his life, yet, after he became emperor, he enjoyed a good state of health, except only that he was subject to a pain of the stomach. In a fit of this complaint, he said he had thoughts of killing himself. He gave entertainments as frequent as they were splendid, and generally when there was such ample room that very often 600 guests sat down together. At a feast he gave on the banks of the canal for draining the Fucine lake, he narrowly escaped being drowned, the water at its discharge rushing out with such violence that it overflowed the conduit. At supper he had always his own children, with those of several of the nobility, who, according to an ancient custom, sat at the feet of the couches. One of his guests having been suspected of purloining a golden cup, he invited him again the next day, but served him with a porcelain jug. It is said, too, that he intended to publish an edict, allowing to all people the liberty of giving vent at table to any distension occasioned by flatulence, upon hearing of a person whose modesty, when under restraint, had nearly cost him his life. He was always ready to eat and drink at any time or in any place. One day, as he was hearing causes in the forum of Augustus, he smelt the dinner which was preparing for the Salii, in the temple of Mars adjoining, whereupon he quitted the tribunal, and went to partake of the feast with the priests. He scarcely ever left the table until he had thoroughly crammed himself and drank to intoxication, and then he would immediately fall asleep, lying upon his back with his mouth open. While in this condition, a feather was put down his throat, to make him throw up the contents of his stomach. Upon composing himself to rest, his sleep was short, and he usually awoke before midnight, but he would sometimes sleep in the daytime, and that, even, when he was upon the tribunal, so that the advocates often found it difficult to wake him, though they raised their voices for that purpose. He set no bounds to his libidinous intercourse with women, but never betrayed any unnatural desires for the other sex. He was fond of gaming, and published a book upon the subject. He even used to play as he rode in his chariot, having the tables so fitted that the game was not disturbed by the motion of the carriage. His cruel and sanguinary disposition was exhibited upon great as well as trifling occasions. When any person was to be put to the torture, or criminal punished for parricide, he was impatient for the execution, and would have it performed in his own presence. When he was at Tibur, being desirous of seeing an example of the old way of putting malefactors to death, some were immediately bound to a stake for the purpose, but there being no executioner to be had at the place, he sent for one from Rome, and waited for his coming until night. In any exhibition of gladiators, presented either by himself or others, if any of the combatants chanced to fall, he ordered them to be butchered, especially the retiarii, that he might see their faces in the agonies of death. Two gladiators happening to kill each other, he immediately ordered some little knives to be made of their swords for his own use. He took great pleasure in seeing men engage with wild beasts, and the combatants who appeared on the stage at noon. He would therefore come to the theatre by break of day, and at noon, dismissing the people to dinner, continued sitting himself, and besides those who were devoted to that sanguinary fate, he would match others with the beasts upon slight or sudden occasions, as, for instance, the carpenters and their assistants, and people of that sort, if a machine, or any piece of work in which they had been employed about the theatre did not answer the purpose for which it had been intended. To this desperate kind of encounter he forced one of his nomenclators, even encumbered as he was by wearing the toga. But the characteristics most predominant in him were fear and distrust. In the beginning of his reign, though he much affected a modest and humble appearance, as has been already observed, yet he durst not venture himself at an entertainment without being attended by a guard of spearmen, and made soldiers wait upon him at table instead of servants. He never visited a sick person until the chamber had been first searched, and the bed and bedding thoroughly examined. At other times, all persons who came to pay their court to him were strictly searched by officers appointed for that purpose, nor was it until after a long time, and with much difficulty, that he was prevailed upon to excuse women, boys, and girls from such rude handling, or suffer their attendants or writing masters to retain their cases for pens and styles. When Camillus formed his plot against him, not doubting but his timidity might be worked upon without a war, he wrote to him a scurrilous, petulant, and threatening letter, desiring him to resign the government, and betake himself to a life of privacy. Upon receiving this requisition, he had some thoughts of complying with it, and summoned together the principal men of the city to consult with them on the subject. Having heard some loose reports of conspiracies formed against him, he was so much alarmed that he thought of immediately abdicating the government. And when, as I have before related, a man armed with a dagger was discovered near him while he was sacrificing, he instantly ordered the heralds to convoke the Senate, and with tears and dismal exclamations lamented that such was his condition, that he was safe nowhere, and for a long time afterwards he abstained from appearing in public. He smothered his ardent love for Messalina, not so much on account of her infamous conduct as from apprehension of danger, believing that she aspired to share with Silius, her partner in adultery, the imperial dignity. Upon this occasion he ran in a great fright, and a very shameful manner, to the camp, asking all the way he went if the empire were indeed safely his. No suspicion was too trifling, no person on whom it rested too contemptible, to throw him into a panic and induce him to take precautions for his safety and meditate revenge. A man engaged in a litigation before his tribunal, having saluted him, drew him aside, and told him he had dreamt that he saw him murdered, and shortly afterwards, when his adversary came to deliver his plea to the emperor, the plaintiff, pretending to have discovered the murderer, pointed to him as the man he had seen in his dream, whereupon, as if he had been taken in the act, he was hurried away to execution. We are informed that Appius Silanus was got rid of in the same manner, by a contrivance betwixt Messalina and Narcissus, in which they had their several parts assigned them. Narcissus therefore burst into his lord's chamber before daylight, apparently in great fright, and told him that he had dreamt that Appius Silanus had murdered him. The empress, upon this, affecting great surprise, declared she had the like dream for several nights successively. Presently afterwards, word was brought, as it had been agreed on, that Appius was come, he having, indeed, received orders the preceding day to be there at that time, and, as if the truth of the dream was sufficiently confirmed by his appearance at that juncture, he was immediately ordered to be prosecuted and put to death. The day following, Claudius related the whole affair to the Senate, and acknowledged his great obligation to his freedman for watching over him even in his sleep. Sensible of his being subject to passion and resentment, he excused himself in both instances by a proclamation, assuring the public that the former should be short and harmless, and the latter never without good cause. After severely reprimanding the people of Ostia for not sending some boats to meet him upon his entering the mouth of the Tiber, in terms which might expose them to the public resentment, he wrote to Rome that he had been treated as a private person, yet immediately afterwards he pardoned them, and that in a way which had the appearance of making them satisfaction, or begging pardon for some injury he had done them. Some people who addressed him unseasonably in public, he pushed away with his own hand. He likewise banished a person who had been secretary to a quaestor, and even a senator who had filled the office of praetor, without a hearing, and although they were innocent, the former only because he had treated him with rudeness while he was in a private station, and the other because in his aedileship he had fined some tenants of his for selling cooked victuals contrary to law, and ordered his steward, who interfered, to be whipped. On this account, likewise, he took from the aediles the jurisdiction they had over cook shops. He did not scruple to speak of his own absurdities, and declared in some short speeches which he published that he had only feigned imbecility in the reign of Gaius, because otherwise it would have been impossible for him to have escaped and arrived at the station he had then attained. He could not, however, gain credit for this assertion. For a short time afterwards, a book was published under the title of Moron Anastoses, The Resurrection of Fools, the design of which was to show that nobody ever counterfeited folly. Amongst other things, people admired in him his indifference and unconcern, or, to express it in Greek, his meteoria and ablepsia. Placing himself at table a little after Messalina's death, he inquired why the empress did not come. Many of those whom he had condemned to death, he ordered the day after to be invited to his table, and to game with him, and sent to reprimand them as sluggish fellows for not making greater haste. When he was meditating his incestuous marriage with Agrippina, he was perpetually calling her, "my daughter, my nursling, born and brought up upon my lap." And when he was going to adopt Nero, as if there was little cause for censure in his adopting a son-in-law, when he had a son of his own arrived at years of maturity, he continually gave out in public that no one had ever been admitted by adoption into the Claudian family. He frequently appeared so careless in what he said, and so inattentive to circumstances, that it was believed he never reflected who he himself was, or amongst whom, or at what time, or in what place, he spoke. In a debate in the Senate relative to the butchers and vintners, he cried out, "I ask you, who can live without a bit of meat?" and mentioned the great plenty of old taverns, from which he himself used formerly to have his wine. Among other reasons for his supporting a certain person who was candidate for the quaestorship, he gave this: "His father," said he, "once gave me, very seasonably, a draught of cold water when I was sick." Upon his bringing a woman as a witness in some cause before the Senate, he said, "This woman was my mother's freedwoman and dresser, but she always considered me as her master, and this I say, because there are some still in my family that do not look upon me as such." The people of Ostia addressing him in open court with a petition, he flew into a rage at them, and said, "There is no reason why I should oblige you. If anyone else is free to act as he pleases, surely I am." The following expressions he had in his mouth every day, and at all hours and seasons: "What? Do you take me for a Theogonius?" And in Greek lale kai me thingain, "Speak, but do not touch me," besides many other familiar sentences, below the dignity of a private person, much more of an emperor, who was not deficient either in eloquence or learning, as having applied himself very closely to the liberal sciences. By the encouragement of Titus Livius, and with the assistance of Sulpicius Flavus, he attempted at an early age the composition of a history, and having called together a numerous auditory to hear and give their judgment upon it, he read it over with much difficulty, and frequently interrupting himself. For after he had begun, a great laugh was raised amongst the company, by the breaking of several benches from the weight of a very fat man, and even when order was restored, he could not forbear bursting out into violent fits of laughter at the remembrance of the accident. After he became emperor, likewise, he wrote several things which he was careful to have recited to his friends by a reader. He commenced his history from the death of the dictator Caesar, but afterwards he took a later period, and began at the conclusion of the civil wars, because he found he could not speak with freedom and a due regard to truth concerning the former period, having been often taken to task both by his mother and grandmother. Of the earlier history he left only 2 books, but of the latter 1 and 40. He compiled likewise the history of his own life, in 8 books, full of absurdities, but in no bad style, also a defence of Cicero against the books of Asinius Gallus, which exhibited a considerable degree of learning. He besides invented 3 new letters, and added them to the former alphabet as highly necessary. He published a book to recommend them while he was yet only a private person, but on his elevation to imperial power he had little difficulty in introducing them into common use, and these letters are still extant in a variety of books, registers, and inscriptions upon buildings. He applied himself with no less attention to the study of Grecian literature, asserting upon all occasions his love of that language and its surpassing excellency. A stranger once holding a discourse both in Greek and Latin, he addressed him thus: "Since you are skilled in both our tongues." And recommending Achaia to the favour of the Senate, he said, "I have a particular attachment to that province on account of our common studies." In the Senate he often made long replies to ambassadors in that language. On the tribunal he frequently quoted the verses of Homer. When at any time he had taken vengeance on an enemy or a conspirator, he scarcely ever gave to the tribune on guard, who, according to custom, came for the word any other than this: "Andra paminastai, ot tis proteros chalapini." "'Tis time to strike when wrong demands the blow." To conclude, he wrote some histories likewise in Greek, namely, 20 books on Tuscan affairs, and 8 on the Carthaginian, in consequence of which another museum was founded at Alexandria, in addition to the old one, and called after his name, and it was ordered that, upon certain days in every year, his Tuscan history should be read over in one of these, and his Carthaginian in the other, as in a school, each history being read through by persons who took it in turn. Towards the close of his life, he gave some manifest indications that he repented of his marriage with Agrippina and his adoption of Nero. For some of his freedmen noticing with approbation his having condemned, the day before, a woman accused of adultery, he remarked, "It has been my misfortune to have wives who have been unfaithful to my bed, but they did not escape punishment." Often, when he happened to meet Britannicus, he would embrace him tenderly, and express a desire that he might grow apace, and receive from him an account of all his actions, using the Greek phrase, "O troses kai iacetai," he who has wounded will also heal. And intending to give him the manly habit, while he was yet under age and a tender youth, because his stature would allow of it, he added, "I do so, that the Roman people may at last have a real Caesar." Soon afterwards he made his will, and had it signed by all the magistrates as witnesses. But he was prevented from proceeding further by Agrippina, accused by her own guilty conscience, as well as by informers, of a variety of crimes. It is agreed that he was taken off by poison, but where, and by whom administered, remains in uncertainty. Some authors say that it was given him as he was feasting with the priests in the capital, by the eunuch Halotus, his taster. Others say by Agrippina, at his own table, in mushrooms, a dish of which he was very fond. The accounts of what followed likewise differ. Some relate that he instantly became speechless, was racked with pain through the night, and died about daybreak. Others, that at first he fell into a sound sleep, and afterwards, his food rising, he threw up the whole, but had another dose given him, whether in water gruel, under pretence of refreshment after his exhaustion, or in a clyster, as if designed to relieve his bowels, is likewise uncertain. His death was kept secret until everything was settled relative to his successor. Accordingly, vows were made for his recovery, and comedians were called to amuse him, as it was pretended, by his own desire. He died upon the 3rd of the Ides of October, the 13th of October, in the consulship of Asinius Marcellus and Acilius Aviola, in the 64th year of his age, and the 14th of his reign. His funeral was celebrated with the customary imperial pomp, and he was ranked amongst the gods. This honor was taken from him by Nero, but restored by Vespasian. The chief presages of his death were the appearance of a comet, his father Drusus's monument being struck by lightning, and the death of most of the magistrates of all ranks that year. It appears from several circumstances that he was sensible of his approaching dissolution, and made no secret of it. For when he nominated the consuls, he appointed no one to fill the office beyond the month in which he died. At the last assembly of the Senate in which he made his appearance, he earnestly exhorted his 2 sons to unity with each other, and with earnest entreaties commended to the fathers the care of their tender years. And in the last cause he heard from the tribunal, he repeatedly declared in open court that he was now arrived at the last stage of mortal existence, whilst all who heard it shrunk at hearing these ominous words. If you have enjoyed this audiobook, please consider supporting the channel in one or more of the following ways.